Good afternoon. Welcome to the third annual Steiner Symposium, and welcome to the Perspectives on the Olympics and Paralympics panel. The Winter Games in Pyeongchang are coming up in 3 short months, but here at Bradley, we think about global sport all year round through our internship opportunities, our classes, and in our programming. In fact, 12 of our students are getting ready to intern with NBC coming up at the games in South Korea. Some of them will be in Connecticut, others will be going to South Korea. So we have been thinking about the Winter Games for quite a while now. The Steiner Symposium, and particularly this year's Steiner Symposium, gives us an excellent opportunity to think about media coverage of global sport and of the Winter Games specifically. Today, we'll link the local to the global. We'll link Peoria, the sporting landscape, to elite global sport in very unique ways. And we seek to understand the complex dynamics of global media coverage from perspectives of journalists, athletes, and scholars. My name is Dr. Dunja Antunovic. I am a faculty member in the Steiner School, and I will be moderating this panel today. Before I introduce our stellar panelists, I would like to say a special thanks to Mr. Paul Hertog and to MassMutual for their generous support of this year's symposium. It is support like this that enables us to bring some of the experts from all around the nation and, in fact, from North America, as we will see today. I will briefly introduce the panelists. You can read their full bios in the program, so you can fill in the information that perhaps I don't cover here. So let us start right here in Peoria. You saw a video of his 2006 Olympic performance. Matt Savoie is a Peoria native, a Bradley graduate, and a Bradley Athletics Hall of Fame inductee. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science, a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Illinois, and a law degree from Cornell Law School. Somewhere in between, he found time to compete at the Olympics. And he competed in figure skating at the 2006 Winter Olympics in Torino, Italy. Mr. Savoie currently coaches figure skating in Boston, and we're thrilled that he's able to join us here, especially considering the busy competition schedule of his athletes. So please help me welcome Mr. Savoie. Well, I'm sure we would all love to attend the games, right? In reality, most of us experience the games through media coverage, and most of us experience global sport through media coverage. A journalist who has been instrumental in telling stories about global sport for Chicago audiences and for national audiences is Mr. Phil Hersh. Mr. Hersh spent 28 years as an Olympic sports writer for the Chicago Tribune, which is actually a very unique role, and I think he will be talking a little bit about that today in the panel. He also has covered 18 Olympic Games, dozens of other global sporting events, including 13 World Figure Skating Championships, which means that he also wrote stories about Matt Savoie. So we have another quite interesting local global connection here. Please help me welcome Mr. Phil Hersh. Athletes and journalists give us insight into the immediate experience of being present at these events. But it is also integral that we take a kind of a big picture view of the patterns in media coverage and their implications for the industry and for society. Research helps us attain that view. Earlier today, you heard about opportunities in postgraduate education, including on research in sports communication. And you heard about it from the world's leading expert on Olympic media scholarship. If you're a sports communication student, you know Dr. Andy Billings' work, and you even had to take an exam on it. He wrote your Com 160 textbook, and many of us assigned his articles in our classes. On this panel, Dr. Billings will be sharing insights from over 140 journal articles and 14 books, including his most recent book titled Olympic Television, Broadcasting the Biggest Show on Earth. Please help me welcome Dr. Andy Billings. Now, many perceive the closing ceremony of the Olympics as kind of an end of a global mega event, but we know better. We know that it's only the halftime. The Paralympic Games have been receiving increased global media attention. At last year's symposium, we heard from Paralympic athletes who competed and/or coached at the Rio Games. This year, we invited a speaker who participated at the Winter Games as a guide in cross-country skiing and who is considered a leading scholar on the intersections of sport, disability, and digital media. Dr. Andrea Bundon brings an athlete's and a scholar's perspective to global sport. Visiting us from Vancouver, Canada, please help me welcome Dr. Andrea Bundon. So you all have tremendous experience of participating in various aspects of global sport and looking at global sport from different angles. What is the main objective of the work you do in your current role? We can start with Dr. Bundon.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really see my work as situated at the intersection between the sociology of sport and critical disability studies. So what that means for me is thinking of sport as a mirror for looking at society, but the critical disability lens also it leads me to explore how we can use sport to change things in our society, and specifically how to change the narratives around ableism and around disability and to promote a more inclusive society. So I use the Paralympics, I think, as a lens to look at issues of injustice and oppression related to disability and think about different ways we can think more positively about disability.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm a coach currently, and strictly figure skating. So my role currently in sport is more developmental, and I think I'm more of an interpreter for figure skating, which is can be a pretty bizarre universe if you're new to it for families, or if you're a kid just interested in it growing up and having seen it on television or the internet and you want to learn more about it. So as a coach, my job is to learn about their interest and keep them interested, help them be as successful as they want to be, and also then contemplate what they want to do with the sport long term, hopefully. Not everyone's going to be an elite athlete, but we always need people to stay on as volunteers, as judges, as officials. I mean, those are the people who run our sport, and part of being a coach is making sure that the experience they have with figure skating enables them to want to stay involved in the future. So that's my main role.
I've always said that one of the reasons I've liked the job that I was fortunate to have on a full-time basis for a long time before I went into semi-retirement was it allowed me to use sport as a way to help people understand different cultures, different people, different political histories. The country, this massive universe now of 200 and something Olympic committees, all of which have wonderful individual historical backgrounds and political backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And an example which is now very timely that I can give again, some of you may be aware of the Catalonian independence movement, which has been going on since a referendum which may or may not have been approved, whatever, in the last month. Prior to the 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona, I wrote a story explaining to the Tribune's readers and anybody else who wanted to read it why Catalonia was not Spain. Even though Barcelona is in Spain, but it is Spain and it isn't Spain. And that's the kind of thing I enjoyed the most, to be able to get in depth to understand why certain places were different, what made them different, why the differences were wonderful, all of those things. That's been my ability to have traveled to more than 50 countries to cover stories like this has given me a great opportunity to myself to learn about the world and hopefully to help anybody reading it learn about the world, because as we all know, with the modern communications, the world has shrunk from this vast sphere to something about like this.
And with my Olympic research, I see my role as asking questions that perhaps no one else is either financially motivated to ask or don't have the time to ask, but are nonetheless pertinent to a wide array of people. So I'm kind of the check on the media somewhat in terms of how NBC, since they really have been nearly the exclusive carrier of the Olympics for the past 20 years, or really the last 30 years, except for CBS in the 90s a little bit for the Winter Games. How does NBC tell those stories? So I ask questions like, what percentage of the primetime telecast was dedicated to men and women athletes? How do they tell stories of athletes of different races? How do they tell those stories honoring different cultural backgrounds without being colorblind? How much of the coverage is devoted to American athletes versus foreign athletes? Does the Olympic telecast, watching it, does that make you more patriotic? So I try to ask different questions about different parts of the process and try to inform what I believe is the biggest show on television. Because 98% of you will watch some form of the Olympics, at least for a small period of time. There's nothing else out there that gets that kind of media penetration.
And you all have dealt with the media in a variety of ways. You either are the media, or you talk to the media as athletes, or you study the media. And so what are some of the major changes you have seen in coverage and the study of sport over the last few years? And perhaps we can start with Dr. Billings, considering you just published your most
Sure.
recent book. What are some of the changes you have observed?
Well, it's interesting when you start at, let's start for a second with the similarities, which is the primetime telecast is remarkably similar, especially, let's say, for the summer games. There are 5 sports that receive roughly 96% of the coverage. That's it. You can probably even name them, swimming, diving, gymnastics, beach volleyball, track and field. Not necessarily in that order, but those are the 5 that you get. Those are appealing to wide demographics of people. Those are things that fit into media segments. That is still the formula. Everything else is changing dramatically. So if I were to try and best characterize this, when I started researching this 20 years ago, the question was, what gets shown? Some things make it to TV, some things don't get shown at all, right? So there are some things that we know were happening, but we had no media coverage of it that reached us. We didn't have enough channels, we didn't have internet options, things like that. Now everything's shown. We can, with digital platforms and things like that, you can watch, if you wanted to, every moment of every event of every part of the games. With the Rio Olympics, that would take you roughly 9 consecutive months without sleeping, but you can do it. So we moved from what gets shown to now where we're at is where does it get shown? Does it get shown on NBC in the evening? Does it get shown at 3 in the morning on MSNBC? Does it get shown only on the digital or mobile platforms? We're about to move, I think, to how does it get shown, which means we have the same competition that we could render in multiple ways, right? So maybe you're watching figure skating in 2018. The Olympics means different things for different people. So for some people, the way they want their figure skating is a little bit of the competition, but they still want medal ceremonies, they want background profiles, they want to know a whole ton about the athletes. Other people just want as much competition as possible. And so we're going to find ways to repurpose those games to the point that there are ways that you can not only get the sport you want, but get it in the manner in which you would most like to receive it.
Mr. Hersh, have you observed these changes, and how have you adjusted?
In my 7 decades on this earth and almost 50 years in the business, I've seen unbelievably dramatic changes, a lot of which the 5 writers here here before us talked about extensively. However, the first big change that I saw occurred actually at the Munich after the Munich Olympic Games during the Munich Olympic Games, and with nothing to do with the tragedy that ended that Olympic Games, and which is the overriding memory for most of us. At the 1972 Olympic Games, there was a great writer for Newsweek, the late Pete Axthelm, who filed a story after the first week, and his editors sent back to him a note that said, "Terrific stuff, Pete. You're going to file a story on Olga Korbut." And Pete said, "Who?" Because U.S. television had made a star out of Olga Korbut, unbeknownst to anybody who was in Munich covering the games live. So for a number of years, TV, the primetime telecast, began to dictate the agenda for what a lot of the print reporting was. That has changed so dramatically, and it changes every 5 seconds. The parameters of technology as they affect journalism are changing so fast and so dramatically that one never knows what you're going to see next. The first time I had to come home from Rio halfway for personal reasons, and I was able to watch the rest of it on all of NBC's platforms, and I was just stunned by the breadth of people complain. I mean, people still complain some of it's delayed, the primetime show is this, the primetime show is that, but anybody who wants to see a particular segment of the Olympics now can see whatever he or she wants. And as Andy was saying, there'll be different ways of showing it, and we'll soon go to drones and virtual reality and augmented reality. I mean, so we had this kind of watershed moment in 1972, and then nothing really changed again until the mid-00s. And then all of a sudden it changes every 5 seconds.
And Dr. Bundon, one of the factors that has perhaps enabled Paralympic coverage to gain more visibility is the digital media technologies, and I know you do a lot of work on that. So what are some of the things you have observed in your work in relation to bringing more attention to Paralympic athletes and the Paralympic Games?
I first became involved in the Paralympics probably about 10 years ago, so 2008 more or less, in the lead up to the 2010 Games in Vancouver. And Dr. Dunja and I were doing our PhDs, both looking at blogs, and I started writing a blog about the Paralympic Games, and I certainly wasn't the only PhD student, sociologist of sport blogging about, but most of my classmates were blogging about the Olympics, and they sort of lived in this constant fear that they would get a cease and desist from the IOC or from one of the official broadcasters, and that was actually happening. So, you know, their blogs, they would get shut down pretty quickly, and then on the other hand, I had this Paralympic blog, and I wondered, would it get any attention? Would the IPC even know it's there? It took them about 3 days to find me. We had 2 blog posts, I think, and the call I got was, we found your blog, we want to start publishing it on some of our platforms. Because that was really their strategy. They had an office of 2 people. I think one of them was a part-time intern. And they were their strategy was to amplify people who were already creating content related to parasport. So if a Paralympic athlete had a Twitter account, if they had a blog, if they had a Facebook page, they would find it and they would cross-post it. And that was their media strategy. And now what we're seeing is quite different. I mean, in 2012, London, Paralympics was the most tweeted sport hashtag of the year. They have 7 channels of their own under Paralympic Sport TV. So they're producing a lot more content now. That's led to some very interesting changes in what I've seen, in the sense that 2010, it was content created mostly by athletes. It had a real authenticity to it. Now what we're seeing is actually the Paralympic model going a lot closer to the Olympic model. There's a lot more concerns around broadcast rights, around protecting sponsors and stuff like that. And you're seeing a lot less content coming from the athletes or from sort of others involved in the movement in that way. So that's been the major shift. But certainly the only reason they've been able to do that has been because of the social media platforms. I mean, their Twitter is their most used tool. They simply don't have the resources of the Olympics, and they rely a lot on social media.
Could you tell us a little bit about your involvement with the Paralympics? What does it mean to be a guide? First of all, we can start with that, and then perhaps how you started asking some of these questions, and you've collaborated with some of the athletes quite closely, and if you could speak a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, being a guy is the best view in the house. I was lucky. I was a cross-country skier myself, and sort of at the time that I was winding up racing on my own, I met an athlete who's visually impaired and who needed a guide. And the athletes I've guided have all had some sight. They've got about 5% vision. So they can see me, but they can't see the ski trail. They can't tell what's the ski trail and what's the snowbank, and they can't tell if the turn coming up ahead, how sharp it's going to be, little depth perception. So my job is really quite simple. I race in front of them, and I wear a radio, and I tell them what I'm doing. So I tell them I'm about to go into a tuck, I'm coming out of my tuck, I'm starting my corner, and I'm just telling them what I'm doing, and they're putting in like a 3-second delay and matching it. And then I'm also giving them sort of information about the strategy on the course, so where their competitors are, what their splits are. And like I said, it's the best seat in the house because you're accredited as an athlete, you've got sort of full access, you're racing, and yet your job is really to make sure that someone else has the race of their life. But like I said, I was starting my PhD, and it was really this exposure to Paralympic Games. I thought I knew sport. I'd been an athlete my whole life. And then starting to see some of the things that these athletes were having to deal with that I simply hadn't had to deal with in my own experiences. That's that's what led to some really interesting conversations. And essentially what came from that was a group of athletes I had skied with, a few friends, other Paralympians. We started this blog, and it was half research project, and it was half just because we wanted to share these conversations we were having on our team with a broader audience. And that's where I really started researching parasport. It's led to most of the research I do is very community-based, is working with Paralympic athletes or other members of the Paralympic movement to talk about essentially what's happening in their sport.
And since we're on the topic of athletes' perspectives and athletes talking about their stories, Mr. Savoie, if you could talk a little bit about what were some of the experiences with the media? Obviously, figure skating is a fairly high-profile winter sport, right? And probably Dr. Billings can tell us more about some of the patterns later on. But what were your experiences with the media? And now that you're working as a coach, have you seen any changes in the way figure skating is covered and how you would have had to approach the media if you were competing now?
Sure. So I competed in 2006. I guess by way of background, and I started like skating in the early 90s, and Tanya and Nancy, which everyone sort of knows about, that was 94. So when I was just starting to compete internationally, there was a lot of attention on figure skating. And it was on TV all the time. I guess as a figure skater, you had the sense that there was lots of opportunity, lots of ways to compete and perform. And that started to taper off, I want to say, in around 2000, leading up to maybe the 2002 Olympics. And then in the 2002 Olympics, there was another scandal with our scoring system. And so as in a figure skating community, those are the two main sort of milestones when you think about how coverage in our sport has changed. And there was a definite drop-off related in part to television contracts, both in maybe funding, in viewership, in attendance at events. And so as an athlete, our relationship with the media kind of changed in the sense that sort of early when I started getting involved, it was kind of easy. You didn't have to do anything. People would, there was media coverage there, and it was a bit taken for granted. And then about 2003, as an athlete, our federation was actually being more active with us, trying to explain to us how we could market ourselves better. And when we interact with television, how we could create stories about ourselves and present ourselves. And for someone who is just wanted to skate and just wanted to be an athlete, that seemed really foreign. And having grown up in Peoria, I really liked just doing my thing. I got out of the sport, luckily before social media became a big force. And so now if I'm thinking about what I would do as a coach with an athlete, it's an entirely different landscape. And I think there's a lot more responsibility on the part of the athlete, to figure out how they're going to manage their personality, their brand. The pitfalls are certainly more numerous, but the opportunities are probably greater as well. So at the same time, you're competing with lots of different sports. I mean, that's another issue besides just the different media landscape. The number of sports that get covered and the intensity, like curling, for instance, is always really popular. People discover it at the Olympics. And so figure skaters spend 3 years being sort of on their own, and then all of a sudden we have lots of other sports to compete with for attention. So it's definitely changed a lot.
Mr. Hersh, you have covered figure skating extensively. And so what are some of your insights into the sport and the coverage of the sport and how it has evolved?
I mean, you've got all sorts of forces at work, and one of which, of course, is the financial difficulties that newspapers are encountering today. So even prior to the Tanya Nancy thing, the national championships, wherever they were, would get media from 15 to 20 newspapers. And the last time I went to a national championships as a full-time reporter for the Tribune, which was 2015, I and Christine Brennan from USA Today were the only two out-of-town reporters there. The same thing is happening on a level of coverage at the Olympic Games. So, and then the other force that's been at work since we've had a men's Olympic champion in 2009, Illinois, and Evan Lysacek. 2010, I'm sorry, he was world champion in 2009. But women's singles is what drives figure skating audiences. And we have not had a great women's single skater since Michelle Kwan left the sport in 2005. So that's, and as great as Charlie White and Merrill Davis, the ice dancers, are and were, and women's singles is what drives audiences. So the coverage has dwindled for a whole number of reasons, and on top of that is the fact, at least for newspapers, everything is now judged on how many people click on your story, and I was appealing to a niche audience. I often said if you were covering the Olympics and you had a 80-page newspaper, you had to be comfortable if you were on page 73. And I was fine with that because I didn't want to be doing anything else. So you've got much, much more attention being paid to professional and university sports than there ever has been before, which gives less and less time, money, and space for everything else. And it's a shame, I think, because I've dealt with athletes in any number of Olympic sports who work every bit as hard as the athletes making $20 million a year, and they are losing their one chance to get attention. I mean, the great thing about the NBA being in the Summer Olympics is you get to see the best players on earth. The bad thing about the NBA being in the Summer Olympics is it takes away a lot of attention from people in sports who get that attention only every 4 years.
And Dr. Billings, based on some of the research you have done, and you've done a series of studies on Olympic coverage, what are some unique elements about Winter Olympics coverage? What are some of the production formats or target audiences that are driving these decisions in terms of which sports get more attention and more airtime?
Yeah, what's really interesting with the winter compared to the summer on NBC is, for instance, the gender gap on clock time has always been wider by a considerable margin. So over the last 20 years, the gap between men and women coverage on the summer games is roughly 51-49. All right, so a 2% gap favoring the men. As a matter of fact, the last two summer games, women got more coverage than men, likely because women won the majority of the medals for the United States. The Winter Games is almost 50-50 in terms of who wins the medals, but when you take out, say, mixed pair skating or any other mixed gender event, it's roughly 60-40 in favor of the men. Actually, even slightly more, I think it's a 24% gap. So it's like 62-38. And I've asked NBC why. They're very surprised by that. They're trying to figure out what goes on in terms of, you know, for them, they have much less inventory for the Winter Games. So perhaps they're going deeper into the performances, even if they aren't competing for a medal in some way there. But that's certainly one trend. I'll say figure skating is, if there's one thing that moves the needle for each, it's figure skating for the winter and it's gymnastics for the summer. And here's your little factoid of the day so you'll know, all right? There are two things that draw, this might be in my textbook, so you guys might know this. All right, there are two things, sports media properties that draw majority female audiences. The Olympics and the Kentucky Derby, all right? And it's real close, but more women for that. What you find there is especially some women who might feel like they are pushed aside and you don't know as much as us on the NFL or basketball or whatever it is, there's a bit more of a zero-sum game on some of these. You know, no one walks in being a huge curling expert.
In Saskatchewan, we are.
Oh, yeah. That's true. That's true. We are exclusively talking about the U.S. here.
Yeah.
But there is something about that that's unique. The last thing I'll mention, based on what Phil said, is there was this notion that in the 90s, and especially at the turn of the century, as we got more internet options, that what was going to happen was that we were going to get a broader coverage of more athletes, more sports, things like that. And that's not what happened. What happened is what he's talking about, where we got deeper on certain things, to the point that now If you look at, for instance, ESPN Sports Center, it's never been higher for the big three sports. Roughly 3/4 of what you get is basketball, baseball, football, to the exclusion of everything else. So what we got was depth instead of breadth. Instead of getting more coverage of figure skating or of tennis or of NASCAR or whatever it is, you got more draft coverage. You got more ways to debate who should be the starting quarterback for a certain team. And so that's a unique development that I think plays into this notion of where does the Olympics fit in our overall sports media palette.
In an increasingly fragmented media audience, television networks are doing the same thing that newspapers do, judging clicks, they're judging ratings. So figure skating ratings have plummeted. So therefore, there's not going to be as much coverage of figure skating. Well, the Olympic Channel is changing that nexus a bit this year. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Olympic Channel. It is now a broadcast channel in the United States. It's not a broadcast channel in a lot of countries yet. All of the current international events, the Grand Prix series, are on the Olympic Channel, but they're all the commentary is all being done from the United States, no matter where the event is. So what's happened is, the networks are in the business of selling advertising. Advertising wants to get as many eyes as possible on the telecast. If figure skating is getting a 1 rating, and talking about the football draft coming up in 9 months is getting a 9 rating, you know what's going to be on television.
And what are the perhaps spaces that we have seen for Paralympic coverage? Do you see perhaps that the International Paralympic Committee is making some efforts in making that content available? And I should mention that Dr. Bundon lived in the UK. She lives in Canada now. She attends international conferences. So you have seen the Paralympic coverage in different contexts. And so what are some of the platforms and avenues through which we can actually see Paralympic coverage?
Yeah, certainly, what both of you were just saying, I mean, that really resonates with Paralympic coverage, that you can watch any event at the Paralympic Games now, but where you're going to be watching it is probably going to be on some streaming on Paralympic TV, and it's not reaching the mainstream audiences. You have to know what's on, and you have to know where to find it. The one games that I think did kind of have that really achieved something different was London 2012, Channel 4 in the UK. They took on the Paralympic Games, and I mean, you said it's the halftime show. The day the Olympics ended, they came out with, thanks for the warm-up, guys, now here's the event. And it was on every one of their channels. It was on every single hour of the day. They had retired Paralympians as the commentators. They had it was linked in with very clever sponsorship and sort of other campaigns and advertising, and it was different coverage than we've ever seen before in terms of Paralympic sport. It was edgier, it was progressive, and it showed us something different. That was 2012. Now, what we're seeing, I think, is there are more, if you ask NBC, if you ask in Canada, CBC, they'll say there's more hours. But a lot of what's being broadcast, it doesn't mean there's more journalists at the Paralympics. It doesn't mean there's actually more cameras. They're taking content that's usually coming from a few people who've stayed behind to cover the Paralympics, or they're taking the streaming content being produced by the IPC and the host media, and they're just playing it more. That's all that's really changed. So I think it takes a really discerning viewer to know where to find something original beyond that 1 hour highlight reel.
And Mr. Hersh, I know you covered Paralympic athletes. You wrote quite a few stories about Josh George, who actually was at Bradley last year. He spoke at the Symposium. And so from a perspective of a reporter who is so invested in international sport, what are some of the reasons why media outlets might not be sending journalists to the Paralympics?
Other than the financial ones, I mean, in terms of normally I would go to a summer games for 30 days. The games themselves would last for 17 or 18 days, but I would be there for 12 days before. There is a gigantic fatigue factor. I can say sadly and shamefully that I've never actually been to the Paralympics. I have written a lot of stories about Paralympians. That's a big factor, the people who you might see, people aren't going to spend that money again. I've often thought, is there a better model? Would separating the Paralympics by year make any difference? And again, things have changed so much it probably wouldn't. to me, the biggest thing that slowly is occurring is that Paralympic athletes are being treated as athletes and not as heartwarming stories. And that's a good thing. I mean, it's been, yes, I mean, the backstories of some of these athletes, our own Tatiana McFadden, the greatest wheelchair marathoner in history, who went to the U of I, their incredible disabled athlete program. It's, she's born in left in an orphanage in Russia, adopted by a U.S. family, and all of what, going back to Sochi as a cross-country skier. She's not only the best wheelchair racer ever, she's also a Paralympic level cross-country skier. I mean, those are great stories, but eventually you have to start treating them, did you win the marathon? Not that you've got this great backstory. And with Tatiana particularly, because she's been so dominant, people, the whole backstory stopped being a story. The story was, God, this woman is good. I mean, she's just good at another level of good than we've ever seen before. And unfortunately, by the limited amount of coverage that you get of the Paralympics compared to the Olympic Games, there's not enough time, there are not enough people there just covering the events as events to tell the stories of victory and defeat, not of all the other things the athlete has overcome in his or her life.
And actually, I should mention, we have one of our last year's panelists in the audience, and Katie Van Cleve is here, who spoke on the intersection of sport and disability. And last year, we talked about the coverage of Tatiana McFadden, and there was a story, the headline was basically that she lost the race, right? She finished second. And those are the types of stories that we don't see that often, right? Where Paralympic
she's so good that losing, for her, losing was a story.
Exactly.
But that's the way it should be treated. It shouldn't be treated, you don't have to tell the backstory every single time.
So we have some students who are getting ready to intern with NBC, and I know we have quite a few students who came back from working with NBC at the Rio Olympic Games. What is some advice or perhaps insight that you could give to students who have aspirations in covering global sport or engaging in global sport, based on, I know this is a broad question, right, that I'm asking you to condense 30 years of experience, but any insights that you could tell them, whether it's practical advice or big picture advice that they could follow as they're getting ready to engage with global sport?
Well, be ceaselessly curious about the world. Do some research. If you're going to China, China, I took Chinese history courses back in college, which was in, I think, another millennium already. But I read as much as I could about contemporary China before I went. And there was no way on the Lord's green earth that I was going to learn either Mandarin or Cantonese in time. But so that's one thing. Be very curious. Try to go with as few pre-convictions as possible. Let your eyes be opened by what you're seeing. Try to learn a foreign language. I was a student, my major in college was early 19th century French pre-Romantic literature. And I speak 3 Romance languages at various levels of fluency. It has helped me sometimes actually doing interviews, a lot of times just as icebreakers. So people think English is more and more the world's language. I get that. And with the internet, it's even more and more the world's language. I get that. But you can make a friendship a lot faster if you can even speak a few rudimentary words of Chinese or Finnish or whatever the country that I was in. But the most important thing is be endlessly curious about the world, and don't think you understand a place before you get there. And I could spend the rest of my life in China and I wouldn't understand 1% of it. So go there with the humility to know you're going to pick up bits and pieces of information and try to create a big picture, but you're not going to create anything more than one piece in a million-piece jigsaw puzzle.
I was going to say, if I were to, I'll endorse that wholeheartedly, and I'll have 2 spurs from that. Number 1, and this sounds very basic, but it's important, learn how to pronounce their name. I know that sounds, of course you should learn that. I've talked to people who've worked for NBC that said that's the way they got the interview. That's the way they got someone to talk to them, and Ann Myers Drysdale was saying, covering basketball, people were drawn to her because they knew she'd learned how to pronounce everybody's name. And she said that put her ahead of at least half of the people there. it's just those little things there. The other thing I would say is don't look at every story through an American lens. They aren't there to see how they compete against Bodie Miller in skiing or whatever it is, or you know, all these different stars or whatever it is. Yes, there's some very good athletes from the United States, but just being able to look at it from a dynamic perspective of saying it's not just all about how is this rendered or how will this be perceived in the United States. Think about what it means globally. And then, as long as you're curious, as Phil's talking about, then you know about the different political structures. You know where that country is on a map. You know what their background is, or it's not just knowing where they grew up, but knowing, is that a really small place? Is it a large place? Is it, oh my gosh, this place has actually got a higher population than New York City? Oh, you know, that gives you some sense there. And I think that's important to show that you care about telling that story.
I'll ask you, Matt, when someone was coming to interview you, and particularly in the internet age where I can find out virtually everything about you within 20 minutes, probably even what you had for lunch yesterday, how much did it impress you when somebody came up and knew something about you as opposed to someone who had not taken any time to learn anything about you or the sport?
Oh, I mean, of course I'd be impressed, and it would make me feel more comfortable just talking to them. I mean, as I said before, I think as an athlete, you tend to just want to focus on what you're doing in that environment, especially if it's at the Olympics and it's like the pinnacle of your career and you need to do well. Having like a friendly face and someone that can put you at ease rather than is approaching you with like something that they want to say rather than just wanting to get to know you or like what you're about, I would be more willing to talk to that person than someone who had more of their own angle in mind coming to me.
I mean, there's no substitute for I've hung around figure skating since 1980. And there's no substitute for the contacts you make and the fact that people, as you say, a friendly face, or whether you like me or not, it's a face you recognize whether it's friendly or not. But the fact is that today you all have an unbelievable advantage researching anything. And there is no excuse for not taking the time. There's no excuse for going into an interview utterly unprepared, because the ability to be somewhat prepared in 15 minutes is very, very easy.
Yeah, I mean, I can't perhaps I don't work in the industry, but if I was giving people advice who are covering the Paralympics for the first time, I think the comment that Phil made is that, you know, the athletes want to talk about their sport. That might include talking about the disability. It might include explaining, you know, how it is that a blind skier navigates around a course, or what is this piece of equipment that we haven't seen in an Olympic competition, but it's essential to them being able to participate. But that's the story they want to tell. I see a lot of interviews with Paralympic athletes that it's the journalist telling the athlete how inspirational they are, telling them how hard they've worked to overcome. They know that. They want to focus on the competition. And there's some really unique aspects of Paralympic sport that really, I think, are worthy of more attention and that the athletes would be happy to talk about. So,
we began this session with a video of Matt Savoie skating, and I don't know how much you were able to hear the audio, but there was quite some emphasis on Peoria and Bradley. And actually, the commentary began with the fact that Matt Savoie is from Peoria, and it ended talking about his academic accomplishments. By that time, I think you had a master's degree, right? And you started law school. You know, in a Chicago Tribune article from 2006 that was actually written by Mr. Hersh, you said that you didn't set out to try to prove you can win national medals from Peoria, Illinois. And so I'm curious to hear how you perceived that particular coverage, right? Because at that point, it seemed like you had an idea that you wanted to have a career outside of sport, right? And so what are the type of stories that you would have preferred to see, or that you liked to see about yourself in coverage?
I guess I had not thought of it that way. I think I was pretty happy with the coverage. I mean, one thing that was really great about being in Peoria, growing up in training here, was that I knew a lot of the people that I ended up interacting with, in the media, local media in particular. Kirk Wessler's in the audience, and he's a reporter for the Journal-Star and reported on me consistently for the Journal-Star, and would go to nationals, and I would see him there, and we develop a relationship. My coach actually, the very first interview I did as a figure skater, well, not that I did any other interviews for any other reason, but it was with a reporter named Dave Aminian, who was actually the hockey reporter. And I think the only reason that did the interview, which was really exciting to me as a 14-year-old, was because my coach knew him from being involved in hockey events in our IHL hockey team. So having sort of a small, nurturing environment like that, where everything was accessible, it was a really good thing. And I was happy to be sort of a representative of that in my Olympic experience. I think that's sort of if any tagline was associated with me, was probably either academics or like small town. I mean, Peoria is not small, but in the media landscape, I think it's not Chicago, so it's something else. And that made me proud. It made me proud to be able to sort of share that with whoever was watching.
Great. Well, let's take a short pause and see if you all have questions for the panelists. Yes.
Phil, tell me again what you said your major was. Why? Why? How did it connect you to the Tribune?
Well, it's a kind of long story. My brother was a brilliant French scholar. He was 11 years older, and I went to the same university, and some of the professors asked me, "Are you Donald Hersh's younger brother?" And I said, "Yes, but you're not going to get the work from me that you got from him." So I thought of I'm a kind of an old-fashioned person about a university education. I believe it's meant to teach you how to read, to write, and to reason, and to think. And I was just happened to be doing it in French. From the very beginning, I was at a level where I was doing all literature courses, and Yale had a great French department at that point. The professors were unbelievable. So I immediately went out, and then you may remember that 1968 was a difficult time to be young and male in this country. So I went into the Army Reserve, and I went to law school for a very brief period. I didn't make it all the way through the way. I got 2 doctors and a lawyer next to me. I'm just a mister here. I didn't make it all the way through. And I started out at a small paper in Massachusetts, where I was in a gorgeous little town on the ocean. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I went from there to the Baltimore Evening Sun, where I covered baseball, which I eventually also covered in Chicago. And then I went to the Chicago Daily News for the last year of its existence. We were part of the group that was going to save the paper. We didn't do such a great job. Then I worked at the Sun-Times, which was the same ownership at that point until Rupert Murdoch bought the Sun-Times. And then in 1984, I went to the Tribune. And so let me go back about, there'd been an Olympics in this country in 1960 in Squaw Valley, California. There had been Olympics in this country in 1932 in Los Angeles. There had been no Olympics in this country until Lake Placid, in that gap until Lake Placid in 1980. So the Olympics as an idea had almost disappeared from people's minds because there wasn't the massive television coverage. We knew the 1984 games were coming up in LA. The 1988 games were in Calgary. And I convinced the editors of the Tribune, who really didn't know they basically didn't know what I was doing for the entire 31 years, but they trusted me that I would do it the right way. I convinced them that we needed somebody to cover the Olympics full time. And I did that basically full time until after London when for financial reasons, I couldn't do the traveling that I once did. But I had what I think was the best job in the world for all of those years. It was a transitional time where you went from working in an office to working at home, so they already were granting me a level of trust that I was actually not sitting at home drinking beer all day, but working, and they trusted me that my story ideas were good, and I just was able to run with it. So that's how it's a short, long story. And I felt I had 6 or 7 sports editors at the Tribune, and I'm really not sure any of them really knew what I was doing. but or really not. It wasn't that I didn't know what I was doing. They didn't really know what I was doing, even though I knew how to do it. So, and I can't thank them all enough for having had the faith in me that I would do it the right way.
My question is for Mr. Hersh or Mr. Savoie. You talked a little bit about the decline in figure skating ratings, and I'm wondering if you give any credence to the argument that one of the primary causes is the average four-year viewer's difficulty in understanding the IJS as opposed to the old 6.0 system.
You're coaching, Matt.
Oh, okay. Well, the IJS is what, it's the International Judging System. And before IJS was instituted, which I guess at the Olympics was 2006, but they sort of had a ramp-up period where they were trying it out. Before that, it was 6.0, and I'm pretty sure you've written about it, how it was a great trademark, 6.0, rather than 10. It wasn't 10, it was 6.0. And it was really exciting when people got a 6.0. And it was easy to digest and understand. I personally don't have, I don't feel attached to the judging system. I feel like what people responded to before was personalities and sort of novelty. And there is an interaction between media coverage and the federation, the sport itself, right? Like we try to adapt to get attention to ourselves because we need attention to thrive. I mean, obviously we love what we do, but we're not going to do it if no one's watching. Or maybe we couldn't afford to do it if no one was watching. In one sense, the reason that we changed our judging system was because we felt like people might stop following us or the IOC might decide they don't want figure skating around if people started to think of it as this corrupt area. Because in 2002, there was a major judging scandal and people associated it with the way we judged the sport. And so they tried to make it more objective by creating this new system, but the new system is incredibly complicated. And it keeps me occupied as a coach. Like, it's great for coaches, wonderful for coaches, because no one understands it. So you need to be there to be able to explain it to people. And we do the best we can. I actually think that it's done a lot of good for the sport. One of the things that's coming, the Olympics is coming up, and we have a skater in the US named Nathan Chen who's doing amazing things technically, things that I've told people I'm so happy I'm not competing now because I just don't understand how he does the sorts of things that he does. Will be trying I think 6 quadruple jumps in his program. When I competed, the winner tried 2 and even that was insane. Although we did have an American who tried 3. In any case, part of the reason that Nathan Chen is doing what he's doing is because we reward that very objectively in our system right now. And I think that that's going to be a draw for people watching the sport. I mean, we don't have a lot of draws anymore. There isn't a lot of novelty. The jumps all look the same, just a little bit spinnier. So we need some newness and some milestones to be able to bring people in. And I think that the judging system has helped, or I hope, fingers crossed, that it will help pull people in. But you might have to see.
Well, I think it's kind of plateaued and it's reached a point where it encourages sameness. You have to do so much in a program, there's very little time to be creative. They're talking about cutting the 30 seconds out of the men's free skate, which is going to mean you're cramming everything into an even shorter period of time. The other problem I have, and I've written extensively about Nathan Chen, and I am awestruck by what he can do on the ice, but the fact is that I've watched a lot of figure skating for a lot of years, and I was actually the young Japanese skater who was second in the world last year, trained some of the summer with Gracie Gold. You may know Gracie because of her Peoria connection, in the Chicago suburbs with a coach named Alex Oryashev, and I went out there and spent part of a day watching Shoma Uno train, and my attention was being diverted a little bit, and he did I think it was a quadruple toe loop, and it happened so fast, and he can spin so fast, that I've been watching this for a long time, and if I needed to be paying rapt attention to watch that his head was going around 4 times. So what I'm saying is that you watching on television, it's hard to see what makes that jump so special. You're told it's special, you know it's special. I've covered the sport for a lot of years, I know how unbelievably hard it is. You can do all sorts of mathematical studies on how high you have to get, how fast you have to spin, how much hang time you have to have, plus the impact on your knee and your body coming down practicing those things. It's unbelievable what he's doing, but it's a lot easier to see the guy running back a kickoff 102 yards through 11 defenders than it is to see the difference between the great quadruple jump and the great triple jump. So, I mean, there are a million arguments about this, about which way the sport should go. It's clearly the pendulum has swung toward rewarding people for doing a lot of very, very difficult jumps. Some people think this is a bad thing. Some people think it's a good thing. I think they're going to have to make some significant alterations going forward. Again, the interest in the United States, I mean, Japan has got a slew of great young men's skaters. Russia has got an endless conveyor belt of young women's skaters now. And it's very hard for the United States to have a skater good enough to break into that. And that, as much as we're all globally interested in great athletes, the fact is you do root for your, since if you're rooting for your local high school, you're rooting for an athlete wearing Team USA, you get more excited about somebody from your own country.
Yes.
I had a question for Dr. Bundon. So you talked about the difference between the 2010 coverage and then the explosion that happened in the United Kingdom in 2012 for the London Paralympics. Was there any sort of effort by the London people after the fact to send out viewership numbers of, hey, this worked? Or did it not necessarily work from a viewership standpoint, and that's why we haven't seen the continuation in that coverage since that point?
It's a good question. They did publish their numbers, and the IPC was pretty proactive as well in terms of saying we're very happy with the coverage that was provided by Channel 4. We're very happy with generally what happened in London, and these were record numbers for us. But whether or not, I just don't think there's been anyone who's been in a position to replicate it yet. I mean, you had Rio. It was a very, very different games, but also the context of disability and the context of the discussion around disability rights, disability inclusion in the UK is in a different place than a lot of other places in the world. So what made it work in the UK, I think, was the fact that you already had this, you had a channel that was ready to really do something progressive, do something different. They got it wrong almost as much as they got it right. I mean, they got a lot of criticism, but they certainly got a lot of viewers. Rio, their conversation around disability was most people didn't know what the Paralympics was. Brazil was not, they had some strong athletes certainly, but they don't have the history of putting forth strong Paralympic teams. So that was the other thing that made London work, is they had a lot of British athletes that they could use. So they could create a big media event, but they had a lot of local, like you said, people pay attention when it's their own nation competing for medals. So I just don't think Rio was in a position to do that. I think we probably won't see that again until possibly, the US, Canada, Australia maybe, New Zealand might have the same climate that would make that possible. But yeah.
What did Russian TV do? Because the Russians fielded a great Paralympic team in 2014. What did Russian TV do? You know?
I don't. Yeah, I don't.
Well, I was in the village, so I saw probably less coverage than most people. But what I can tell you from sort of there was media everywhere. The attendance was fantastic.
In Sochi.
In Sochi.
Yeah.
I competed in Vancouver, which I thought those crowds were great. They were also local. They were my friends, my family were all out watching. We didn't know what to expect in Russia. And in fact, a lot of sort of what we've been told to expect led us to think these would be empty stadiums and there wouldn't be a lot of people. We had full crowds every single day. It was sold out. And I remember one race, coming into the final 400 meters, and I'm screaming at Margarita over the megaphone or over the radio. I can't hear my own voice. It was so loud. And they were very educated spectators. So after the race, Paralympics, the security's not quite the same. You can go into the stadium or into the crowds, into the stands, you can talk to people. They knew what they were there watching. They understand the rules, they understood the competition. So I don't know what was being shown on the Mia, but whatever it was, it certainly worked at some level. But there wasn't a lot, you'd finish your race and you'd walk through sort of that mingle zone or whatever, and there'd be a couple reporters.
Yeah, that's...
There weren't a lot of international media still there. And we were also out at skiing, which is, another few hours from the main village. Maybe if you were at sled hockey, there was more media there, but...
I mean, does Paralympic, because there are the Special Olympics World Games and the Special Olympics in the United States, you're almost in some ways competing against yourselves for the premier event.
Yeah. And you and I were having a conversation, there's a lot of complexity to Paralympic sport, understanding the classification system, understanding why there's 6 100-meter finals of what looks like the exact same event if you don't really understand the classification system. That's hard to get across to audiences in short time frames, and when you're only doing it every 4 years. And then when you add that you've got Special Olympics, which, I mean, anyone involved will tell you these are 2 very, very different events with very different priorities, with very different athletes. But that doesn't come across to an audience who
I
is
think
seeing
they're
it for the first time.
conflated in the public mind as
Exactly,
being the same
yeah.
thing. And the Paralympic athletes are a much higher level of
It's a different focus. I mean, the Paralympics is very clear. Their brand is elite
inclusiveness.
sport.
And I'm sorry, the Special Olympics is inclusiveness and the Paralympics is
Exactly. Special Olympics is going for inclusivity. They're going for participation. Paralympics is going for elite sport. But that's hard to convey.
Yes.
I'd like to first thank you guys for coming here. It's been really informative and helpful. My question is kind of directed towards Andy and Phil. As you guys are speaking about the advent of how technology has kind of changed the coverage of sport altogether, I think that technology has also brought forward new sports in general. And recently I've seen how there have been discussions about video games and esports being brought into the Olympic sphere at least by 2020. I mean, recently an American esports team was just recently purchased by the San Antonio Texans owner. Where do you guys see this whole new world of sport? Do you think it will be something that is going to be incorporated into the Olympics? And how do you think that people are going to adjust to a new form of sport that is not physical at all, if anything like that?
You know, this is, well, I was listening to the social media panel earlier, and there were people who were huge stars who I'd never heard of. So I'm probably the wrong guy. I think you need to ask your friends how they would, the Olympics is, the International Olympic Committee is trying to quote unquote modernize Olympic sport to attract to attract future audiences, which is why, various forms of extreme skiing, from snowboarding to big air to all these other things, have been added to the Olympics, which is why they're talking. And the only reason that they're talking about e-sport, and I'm not going to get into the discussion, is this sport or is it a game, because you can have that discussion about golf and a lot of other things as well. The discussion about e-sport, I think, would be based on the idea that they will get your eyeballs to watch, and if they see that somebody else will try to do coverage of e-sport in another venue, not the Olympics, and they will see, are people watching? Are they people in the 15 to 20 or the 12 in the case of video games, or the 8, maybe the 8 to 25-year-old demographic? And that's what will determine, I think, whether esports gets into the Olympics. I mean, there are a lot of, sadly enough, I am sort of the target Olympic audience right now. People in my 50 and up are the target Olympic audience, and that's not a sustainable model, because there are a lot more of you who are not 50 and up. So they've got to find ways to make this more appealing to a generation that has different priorities of how they watch things, why they watch things, and where they watch things. And how means you're watching while tweeting and Snapchatting and on something else. And a lot of people consume sports simply by watching highlights on YouTube. I mean, this is all part of a much broader discussion. But people, the other one that's been thrown around lately is pole dancing, which seems to me to be both a misogynistic idea and I don't get that. But esports, I could see happening. I mean, I really could see it happening.
It's lucrative. I mean, we're seeing prize pools of over $20 million currently, and so it seems that they're almost needing to adjust to this. But when you have a 40 to 50-year-old demographic, how do you make something like that pull to those demographics?
Well, I mean, if obviously with projecting big pictures of the game being played on the screen, you can see everything that the gamer, he or she, is seeing. So the audience would, if you are a gamer, you'd have a spectacular view of it. And if they find that people are watching it in massive numbers, they may try it. And then the debate about is it sport or is it a game will will, go on and on and on. But I mean, there are events like modern pentathlon, which is as old as the Olympics, basically, which they've tried to modernize by pushing it all into one day. But it's, shooting and riding and swimming and I can't remember all 5 events anymore. Fencing, everything that a soldier used to have to do. And there's nothing modern about modern pentathlon. And that's the problem. You've got a lot of sports that don't appeal to, don't even appeal to much people who are much closer to my age than they once did. So.
Yeah, and I'll simply say, I don't believe esports is on its way. I believe it's here. And I don't think you can deny some of the numbers you're seeing. For instance, the number 1 streaming site in this country is YouTube. Number 2 is Netflix. Number 3, Twitch. That is showing you where it fits in. Now, we can have debates on whether it's sport, whatever it is. I think that's going to end fairly soon because colleges are starting to have competitive teams. They're calling them sports teams. We're having a hard time figuring out, do they fall under athletics? Are they academics? Are comm programs going to embrace them? We're dealing with that right now at Alabama. There's going to be a team at some point here, and the question is, how do you navigate that? But once you have college stars, once you know that this is drawing the audience, I think that's huge. One last ancillary thing I'll mention, since Phil brought it up, is I think we're starting to redefine what it means to follow the Olympics. 20, 30 years ago, it was, well, I watched it on TV. That's the way you follow the Olympics. You might read about it in the newspaper in the morning and then watch it on TV. Now we're trying to figure that out. What does it mean when you say you're an Olympic fan? And it might not mean that. It might be social media. It might be highlights on your phone, whatever it is. Right now I've got a grant with the International Olympic Committee that's looking at 6 different nations, trying to figure out, does mobile use supplement or replace traditional television use for the Olympic Games? Because that's huge for them. That's their largest revenue stream. So if they're losing television and instead people are going to other digital platforms that they don't know how to monetize, at least not properly monetize, that's part of this larger conversation too.
So the Olympics are a rare occasion when a bunch of different nationalities can come together and be around one another. So how important is it to not only discuss the Olympics as an opportunity for development in sport, but an opportunity for the development of international relations and interactions as well?
Well, Matt, you've experienced Olympic villages, and so have you, Dr. Bundon, so you talk about that.
Well, I mean, I guess there's always been sort of this myth about the Olympics as being, the Pax Olympica. That's sort of the premise of it. But we know it's far, far more complex than that. And it is, I think there's a lot of people who say we need to keep the politics out of sport, but actually that's the only point I see, is that it is this really rare opportunity where you get different nations together and they're going to have conversations because they all want to be at the Olympics or the Paralympics. So, there's going to be if I'm thinking about the stories that I'm going to be watching at 2018, Russia's not in the Paralympics. They're currently banned. They're not banned from the Olympics because the IPC, for the first time ever, I think, has made the decision to depart. Usually IPC follows where the IOC goes. And yet when the doping scandal came out right before Rio, the IPC decided they would ban the Russian Paralympic Federation, and they're not reinstated yet. And this is going to be a huge deal. If they don't get reinstated within the next, I think it's 2 weeks or something, their athletes won't be there. And given that the Winter Paralympics are much smaller than the Summer Paralympics, there's only a few nations there, and given that Russia is one of the powerhouses and in 2014 swept the podium in multiple events, there's going to be some really interesting, we're going to see some people on the podium, we're going to see some really interesting opportunities if Russia isn't really reinstated. So I like that. I like that the IPC has said, listen, we don't have to do what the IOC does, and this doping scandal is not something that we're willing to sort of sweep under the rug, and I welcome those conversations, and I say keep the politics in.
I mean, I think it does create opportunities. Actually, the angle I'm thinking about for 2018, at least from figure skating, is that I think North Korea's first athletes to be able to get into the Olympics were figure skaters. So, and that apparently eased tensions because people were worried that North Korea might not have anyone. And then what's gonna, it's such a big event. At the same time, from an athlete's perspective, I mean, like being in the village, yes, you meet people. I think politics probably is not anywhere near the front of anyone's mind. And at the same time, we all leave and we go back to our countries, and then maybe we meet again in different capacities in our sports, like on committees or as officials. And so those relationships just grow and evolve over time. So just in that respect, I think the Olympics present an opportunity for people to make connections and keep keep those relationships going.
For all of the, this is my sort of idealistic view, but it's realistic. For all of the internal corruption in Olympic sports management, for all of the gigantism of the games, for all of the issues of doping, for all of that, for 17 days you get people from 206 countries if it's the summer games, many of whom have no diplomatic relations with each other, many of whom have been at war with each other recently or currently, and they're in an environment where you're competing, which is naturally a friction-filled environment, and yet people somehow seem to get along for 17 days. Now, I understand it's 17 days and it's totally meaningless in the big picture, but isn't it nice to have even 17 days like that? That's one of the things that's attracted me to the Olympics. You do see the Olympics, for all that's wrong with them, tend to bring out the best in ourselves. And I'll talk to you for 1 minute about Nikki Hamlin and Abby D'Agostino. You may remember this from the women's 5,000 meter race in London. One of them fell, helped the other one up. The other one fell, and Abby actually had a broken leg, and Nikki helped her struggle across the finish line. And it was one of those moments, those touchy-feely, wonderful moments when you said, it's bigger than a medal. And this happens in high school cross-country meets, in high school wrestling matches, in whatever. I mean, it happens, but the world was watching this. And at a moment like that, you feel like this can be something special. And even if it's only 17 days, and even if there are all sorts of judging disputes and other disputes, that there is something intrinsically valuable about the Olympics. And there are so many things that within management of them that need to be changed and to cleaned up and whatever to keep them, because I think the Olympics are right now in an absolute crisis of confidence. Cities don't want to bid for them because they're costing too much. That ongoing Russian doping scandal, which has gone on now since before the Rio Games. But I think eventually if you can take a step back when you're there and realize what you've seen and how you've talked to athletes, when the Tutsi and Hutu were at horrible bloody war in Africa, in Rwanda, there would be, you'd see members of both Rwandan tribes in an Olympic village. And the same thing happened in Kenya, which had horrible riots about 10 years ago. And this, in Southeast Asia where countries were at war with each other. So it's not all bad and it's not all good, but you do get this lovely little 17-day interlude of in this tiny little environment of peace in the world.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming together here in Peoria to talk about these important issues. And thank you all for being here. The Steiner Symposium is not over. We have our final session at 7 p.m. tonight. Join us, please, in Peplo Pavilion. Thank you for being here.